Welcome to Run Talk, the show where we talk about running. I'm Dr. Jason. On today's show, we're going to talk about one of the most common things related to running and training, probably one of the most popular physiological factors, and that is VO₂max. You know, it sounds like a disease. Honey, stay away, I have VO₂max. And so today's show is going to be all about VO₂max, what it is, how to train it, and all the things you want to know about VO₂max. And we'll take questions from the audience as we go. So this is our first episode. We're really happy. This is our very first episode of Run Talk on the show where we talk about running. And so let's get started. VO₂max, like I said, it sounds like a disease. Honey, stay away, I have VO₂max. VO₂max is the maximum volume of oxygen that the muscles can consume per minute. Now that's a little bit esoteric. What does that really mean for you and your running performance? Well, any race or any all-out effort that takes longer than 2 to 3 minutes is more dependent on the ability for your muscles to use oxygen to regenerate this very important biomolecular compound that we all learned about in high school biology class, ATP, adenosine triphosphate. And we have multiple ways to regenerate ATP for muscle contraction. The way that we use it throughout life is by using oxygen inside a very important part of the muscle where aerobic metabolism takes place, and that's called the mitochondria. Inside the mitochondria, which is a very beautiful organelle deep inside your muscle fibers, we have a lot of enzymes that go through they catalyze a lot of chemical reactions that ultimately regenerate ATP for muscle contraction. And life is aerobic. Life requires oxygen. There are actually very few things we do in life that does not use oxygen. You know, sprinting very fast or lifting a very heavy object off the ground. Those kinds of things would be, quote, anaerobic in the absence of oxygen. But most of the things we do in life, me just sitting here talking to the camera, this is an aerobic activity. And so I'm using oxygen. My muscles are using oxygen to move. You move my hands when I speak. And my postural muscles are using oxygen to keep me upright so I don't fall over. So oxygen is always being used. And so VO₂max, the V stands for volume. O2 is oxygen, just like we learned about in high school biology class. And max is maximum. It's the maximum volume of oxygen, the maximum amount of oxygen that our body can consume in a given amount of time. And that given amount of time that we express this in is usually 1 minute. If we go into a laboratory, we measure it in 1 minute. The milliliters of oxygen that we consume per minute. And so the higher that amount, the higher that volume, when you're running at maximum, then obviously that has huge implications for your running performance. Because the higher that maximum, that means the more oxygen that your body can consume, the more oxygen that your muscles can use in a given amount of time. So it's the maximum volume of oxygen that the muscles can consume per minute. And that's got huge implications for running performance. In fact, it's one of the 3 big factors that influence how fast a person can run distances. Not sprinting. Sprinting is something completely entirely different. But any race that takes more than 2 to 3 minutes is more heavily influenced by the VO₂max. It is the most common test. If you go to any laboratory all over the world, any exercise physiology laboratory, a VO₂max test is the most common test that is done. We do this on humans. We do this on all different other kinds of animals. We know what the VO₂max is of all these different mammals and all these different insects even. It's very interesting how scientists are fascinated by the use of oxygen because it is so paramount for life as well as for performance. It is the most common test that is done in an exercise physiology laboratory all over the world. VO₂max was first measured in the 19-teens, a very, very long time ago, when we didn't even have the fancy computerized equipment. Everything was done by hand. Everything was very meticulously done. It was actually a very difficult test to do back in the 19-teens, the 1920s and 30s, before all these computerized systems. But even back then, they were measuring the VO₂max on humans as well as other animals. So it's a very common test. If you haven't had the test done yourself, it's a great experience to go through just to see, just to experience the test and see what your VO₂max is. You can't believe what's on the GPS watches that people wear, like the Garmin will tell you what your VO₂max is. But those are just estimated numbers based on what your heart rate is at a given pace. There are relationships we know, and so we can predict or estimate what the VO2 max is because we know that as heart rate increases, the VO2 increases. In fact, there's a very close relationship there. So to get nerdy and mathematical, we're going to talk about everything on this show. We're going to talk about things that other people won't talk about. VO2 equals your heart rate times your stroke volume, so the volume of blood pumped per beat of the heart, your stroke volume times your heart rate times what's called the arterial venous oxygen content difference. The difference in oxygen content between arterial blood and venous blood. So we really have two major parts of the VO2 equation. We have the volume of blood being pumped out of the heart per beat and per minute, and then we have the muscle's ability to be able to use the oxygen that is being delivered to it. So we have oxygen delivery on one hand by the heart and oxygen use on the other hand by the muscles. And those two things together equal the amount of oxygen that is consumed by your body. So heart rate times stroke volume, which together equals the cardiac output. The amount of blood being pumped out of the heart per beat times the number of beats per minute equals the cardiac output, the volume of blood being ejected out of the heart per minute. So we take that cardiac output, multiply it by the difference in oxygen content between arterial blood, blood going to the muscles, and venous blood, blood coming back from the muscles to the right side of the heart. Because that difference represents the amount of oxygen that the muscles have taken up and consumed. Arterial blood goes to the muscles, venous blood comes back from the muscles to the right side of the heart. So the more oxygen that has been extracted from the blood and used by the muscle mitochondria, then the greater or the wider the arterial venous oxygen content difference. Does that make sense? Yes or yes? Very good. I'm glad we're on the same page. So that represents the VO2 equation. So when does VO2 max happen? When we reach our maximum stroke volume, our maximum heart rate, and the maximum difference in oxygen content between arterial and venous blood. When all three of those variables in that VO2 equation reach their maximum value, then by definition, we reach our VO2 max. And so as heart rate increases, cardiac output increases, and as cardiac output increases, the VO2 increases because they're on opposite sides of the equal sign of the equation. The VO2 equals the stroke volume times the heart rate times the arterial venous oxygen content difference. So we got that. So how do you train the VO2 max? This is all fine and good, but how do you train it? Well, that equation tells you how to train it. There are two major ways that we can train the VO2 max. We can focus on the cardiac side and the blood flow from the heart to the muscles, or we can focus on the muscular side and that arterial venous oxygen content difference. What's going to make the muscles better at consuming more oxygen? So there are two different ways we can attack or address the VO2 max with training. So let's start with the muscular side first. What's going to enhance the underlying factors that influence the muscle's ability to consume oxygen? Well, we already know, as I said a couple minutes ago, it's the mitochondria. The mitochondria are the factories, you can think about them. They're the factories where aerobic metabolism takes place. And the enzymes involved in metabolism inside the mitochondria, those are the factory workers. And so the more workers you have, then the greater the capacity for aerobic metabolism, aerobic work. And so how are you going to make more mitochondria? Well, guess what? The mitochondria are very sensitive to the volume of work performed. The greater the volume of work performed, the more mitochondria we get. We can more than double the amount of mitochondria that we have inside our muscles. Isn't that amazing? Yeah, that's amazing. Oh, I'm glad you believe that. Glad you think so. So we increase the volume of running. We do. That's why good runners run a lot. That's one major reason why good runners run a lot. To affect the mitochondria. The more mitochondria you have, which are very sensitive to the volume of work done, then the greater the capacity for the muscles to consume oxygen. Another great adaptation that we make is more capillaries. We have all these tiny little blood vessels that perfuse our muscle fibers like a beautiful spider web network. And we can enhance that spider web network so that we can perfuse the muscle with more capillaries. The more capillaries we have, the greater the ability for oxygen to diffuse from these tiny capillaries inside the mitochondria, because the closer the distance will be of these blood vessels to the mitochondria, which are scattered out throughout the interior of the muscle fibers, deep inside the muscle. And that's also very sensitive to the volume of work that you do. And so when you increase your running mileage from week to week and month to month and year to year, you proliferate the capillaries. And that's called capillarization. We make more capillaries. We build a larger capillary network. We have these small tubes of capillaries. We branch off. We make them wider. We enlarge the capillaries themselves. And we branch off new branches from these existing capillaries. And so there's a couple of ways in which we enhance this spiderweb network around the muscle fibers. And that's why it's important to run more. So even if that running is easy, if we run more and more and more, we make more mitochondria, we make more capillaries, we make more enzymes inside of those mitochondria, and we enhance the muscle's ability to use the oxygen that is being delivered to it. And that's why increasing the volume of running is so important. Now let's look at the other part of that equation. Say we're already doing a lot of easy running. Now we want to focus on the heart's ability to pump blood and oxygen to the muscles. How are we going to do that? Well, we do that by running at a higher intensity, to focus on the heart as a muscle to be a better pump. How do we do that? Well, we go back to that equation. The VO2 max equals the stroke volume max times the heart rate max times the maximum difference in oxygen content between arterial and venous blood. So we run at maximum heart rate, because if we want to improve the VO2 max, we run at the intensity that is going to cause us to reach VO2 max, that VO2 max pace. And so how do we do that? We do an interval workout where we reach our max heart rate, or get as close as possible to max heart rate during each rep of the interval workout. And since it takes some time for the heart rate to increase when you run, it takes time for it to reach maximum. It increases almost linearly at first, and then it becomes more curvilinear as you keep running. So the heart rate responds as you run. It's not, as we all know, as people wear heart rate monitors, you know that right away when you start running, the heart rate jumps up rather quickly, but then it starts creeping up more slowly as the pace gets faster and faster. So it takes time for the heart rate to reach its maximum. So that's why we want the reps of an interval workout to be at least 3 minutes. 3 minutes is kind of the low end. You can even go shorter than that, but then the recovery in between would have to be very, very short so that heart rate doesn't drop down, the VO2 doesn't drop down too much. So like a classic VO2 max interval workout would be 3-minute reps where you're running hard enough to cause you to reach your max heart rate, but no harder, just hard enough that you're going to reach your max. So think about what's the slowest pace I can run at which I'm going to reach my max heart rate. For pretty good runners or very good runners, it's approximately 2-mile or 3K race pace. For more recreational type runners, then it's closer to 1 to 1.5 mile race pace. Or if you're thinking in terms of kilometers, it's more like 1,600 to 2,400 kilometer race pace. Think about a race that will take you about 7 to 10 minutes to run. So that's why, for really good runners, it's getting close to 2 miles. For everybody else, it may be more like 1 mile or 1.5 mile race pace. That's the pace that corresponds to 100% of VO2 max, or 100% of max heart rate. Because max heart rate will occur at the same time VO2 max occurs. Again, based on that equation. If you open up any exercise physiology textbook, you'll see that equation. It's called the Fick equation, named after the guy who discovered it a long, long time ago. So that's how you would do a VO2 max interval workout. Run 3-minute reps, hard enough that you reach your maximum heart rate, and then recover for equal to or a little bit less than equal to the amount of time you spent running. So if you go 3-minute reps, then recover, jog for 2 to 3 minute recovery, and then repeat it again, and then again, and then again, and keep going until you're fully exhausted. One thing I'll mention about interval workouts, you see a lot of people, there's a million freaking running coaches in America. That's a talk for another show. But you see when people write training programs, a lot of them will put number of reps. You see this in books, you see it, in just coaches who write training programs. Today we're going to do, 4 times 3 minutes or 5 times 3 minutes. The number of reps is arbitrary. Think 1 rep at a time and keep doing the workout until you are fully exhausted. because that's what represents the stimulus for improvement. You have to cause fatigue in order to cause change. You have to fatigue the muscle in order to make changes. And your heart, interestingly enough, responds rather elegantly to this kind of a workout. Just like if you wanted to get bigger biceps, you would go into a gym. Can't go into gyms now because they're all closed, but when the gym's open, you can go into a gym and you do bicep curls until the muscle is fatigued. And the muscle responds by increasing the number of proteins inside the muscle. The proteins responsible for muscle contraction, actin and myosin. We pack more actin and myosin proteins inside the muscle, and the muscle enlarges. And that's how one way how we get stronger, because strength is related to the cross-sectional area of muscle. Well, the heart responds very similarly. We make a larger left ventricle. The left ventricle of the heart's the most important because it pumps blood all the way to the rest of the body. The right side of the heart is responsible for pumping blood to the lungs to pick up oxygen and dispel carbon dioxide. And the left side of the heart is responsible for pumping blood everywhere else in the body except for the lungs. So that's why the left ventricle is the most important chamber of the heart, and it's the largest. In response to doing these VO₂max interval workouts, we actually enlarge the left ventricle. Because the more blood it can hold, the larger the container, the larger the chamber, the more blood it can hold. The more blood it can hold, the more blood it can subsequently pump with each beat. And that amount of blood pumped with each beat, as we talked about before, that is called your stroke volume. The volume of blood pumped per beat. That is the biggest difference between an endurance-trained individual and a couch potato in terms of their cardiovascular performance and fitness is the stroke volume. Max heart rate is mostly related to age and genetics. Your max heart rate doesn't really change hardly at all with training. It may decrease a little bit to allow more time in between beats so that we can maximize our stroke volume and fill more blood into that chamber. But the biggest difference between someone who is endurance trained, aerobically trained, and someone who's not is the stroke volume. That's also one reason why at rest your heart rate is lower when you're fit, when you're aerobically fit. Because if you have more stroke volume per beat, the heart doesn't need to beat as fast every minute in order to expel a certain amount of blood. Because at rest, our cardiac output, so your cardiac output is basically the same as my cardiac output when we're sitting here talking to each other at rest. It's about 5 liters per minute. You have about 5 liters per minute of blood being circulated throughout your body every minute. And that's independent of fitness level. That's more dependent on body size, blood volume, which is dependent on body size. And so bigger people may have a slightly larger blood volume than a smaller person. But that has nothing to do with fitness. So we're always trying to maintain a given cardiac output. And cardiac output equals stroke volume times heart rate. So we can achieve that 5 liters per minute 2 different ways. We can either have a high heart rate and a low cardiac output, or we could have a low heart rate and a high stroke volume. And so that's one reason why fit people have a lower resting heart rate, because their stroke volume is so high, so their heart rate can be low at rest to equal a given 5 liter per minute cardiac output. Isn't that pretty cool? Yeah, that's pretty cool, Jason. Oh, I'm glad you think so. Welcome to Run Talk. If you're just joining us, this is Run Talk. I'm Dr. Jason. Every week on the show, we will discuss a different theme. Today's theme is VO₂max. Let's see if we can get some audience questions. Since now we have a background on VO₂max and how to train it, then let's see if we have some viewer questions. Feel free to ask some questions about VO₂max. Don't ask, why does my knee hurt? That's the topic for another show. Today's show is all about VO₂max. So we will open it up to some viewer questions. And as we wait, we'll talk a little bit more about VO₂max and training. And so, interval training is a very potent way to improve the VO₂max. Actually, the research shows that highly trained runners need that intensity in order to further improve the VO₂max. Initially, if you're a recreational runner or you are just getting off your couch and you're starting to run, the VO₂max will increase just by running more volume, just by increasing the amount of running you do each week or each day or each week. Then the VO₂max will increase. But once you have already done a significant amount of easy running, then you need the interval train, you need the intensity to really focus on the heart's ability to become a stronger, better pump. Okay, we have a viewer question from Elect Runner. which are the other two parameters apart from VO2 max that matter? Very good. We will save that for other shows, but to foreshadow a little bit, to make sure you keep viewing, the other two factors are lactate threshold, and more specifically the speed at lactate threshold, and running economy, the VO2 at submaximum speed. So VO2 max represents the amount of oxygen consumed at maximum when you're at the upper limit, and running economy is the VO2 at submaximal speeds. But we will save that for another show. But thank you for the question. Very good question. Welcome to Run Talk. I'm Coach Jason. We are going to have this show every Monday at 12 p.m. Pacific and 3 p.m. Eastern Time. So make sure you tune in each week. We're not fancy with the commercials. I'm not reading from a teleprompter like those people on TV read. I'm only reading when I read the questions. That this is all off the cuff. And we will say things, I'll shoot straight with you. I'll tell you when people say things that are wrong. I'll tell you what is right. I'll tell you what the research says. This is a research-based show. You come here to get the truth. I have that responsibility to give people the truth. There are a lot of, as I said before, there are 1 million people who call themselves running coaches on social media. Most of what they say, they have a very rudimentary understanding of what's taken place. We shoot straight on this show. You will get the truth every single time. And if I don't know something, I will tell you I don't know it, and I will go and find out the answer, and I'll broadcast it on the next show. That is a promise from me to you. Next question. Also, you mentioned a relation between genetics and VO2. Yes, so VO2 max has a pretty high genetic component. Some people just have a very strong heart naturally that pumps a lot of blood, and they're born with a lot of mitochondria. I'm glad you brought that up, because mitochondria are very interesting, because there's a huge genetic component to mitochondria, because mitochondria have their own separate DNA. Unlike everything else in your body that you inherit from both your parents, mitochondria you only inherit from your mother. And the reason for that is because, it's a little bit of a sex ed lesson, but we talk about everything on this show. Mitochondria have their own separate DNA. And when you have two people who are in love and they want to make a baby, you have the sperm from the man who swims upstream inside the woman's, goes through the cervix into the vagina and eventually fertilizes an egg. And when the sperm meets the egg, the sperm has two parts. It has the head of the sperm and it has the tail, which allows it to swim. That's called the flagella. The tail of the sperm, called the flagella, that allows it to swim up. It's got to go upstream, so it's got to have a pretty powerful tail in order to swim upstream inside the female to meet the egg, to meet up with the egg. It's got a very important date with the egg. And so which part of the sperm goes inside the egg? Only the head of the sperm, which has the DNA for everything else. It tells you what your eye color is going to be and how tall you're going to be and how cool of a guy you're going to be. That's all inside the head of the sperm. And so you get your eye color and your height and your interests and all the things that make you you. You get that from a combination of both your mother and your father. But because all the mitochondria are in the tail of the sperm, because that's where aerobic metabolism takes place and allows the sperm to swim upstream, all the mitochondria of the sperm are in the tail. But mitochondria have their own separate DNA. It's called mitochondrial DNA. But the tail never makes it inside the egg. Only the head of the sperm makes it inside the egg. So you only inherit your mitochondrial DNA from your mommy. And that's why if you have a mother who's a good endurance athlete, you inherit the mitochondrial from her, and that's one thing that can help you be a good endurance athlete. It's not the only thing, of course. There's many factors that go into distance running performance. But you inherit your mitochondria only from your mother, not from your father, because of how the mitochondria are only in the tail of the sperm, and that never makes it inside the egg. So there's your sex ed lesson that we combined with the lesson on VO2 max. Okay, let's get to some more questions. After taking a break from running due to injury, do we lower our VO2? A very good question, yes. There's a lot of truth to use it or lose it. Everyone's heard that. There is a lot of truth to that. And it turns out that VO2 max is one of the first things that decrease when you stop running. Within 2 weeks, you see a significant decrease in the VO2 max. And so even though breaks in training are important from time to time, you have to understand that when you come back from a break, you can't just pick up where you left off with the training, because your fitness is going to decrease, because the VO2 max does decrease. One of the things that affects VO2 max is blood volume, which is one of the things that increases immediately when you start training. Blood volume, you have plasma volume expansion. That happens pretty early in your training life. If you take somebody off the couch and start training them, right away they increase the plasma volume of the blood and they have a greater blood volume. They also start the process of making more red blood cells to help transport oxygen in the blood, make more hemoglobin. These are all things that happen rather quickly. Stuff like the cardiac output from the heart, improving that takes a much longer period of time. And building more mitochondria, that takes a longer period of time. But the blood volume expansion, that happens pretty quickly. And you lose that pretty quickly as well. And so to directly answer your question, when you stop training, even for 2 weeks, you already see a significant decrease in the VO2 max. Having said that, one way, now if you're injured and you can't run, that's a different story. For people who just want to take a little break, it's what's better if you're not so fatigued that you have to. Sometimes you just have to take a break. Like after running a marathon as fast as you can, it's good to take at least a week off, if not 2. But during the training, sometimes, rather than taking a complete break, it's better to do like a mini taper where you drastically reduce the volume and keep in just a little bit intensity so that you can decrease the reduction in these physiological factors like VO2 max. If you maintain some intensity but drastically reduce the volume, then you can reduce fatigue but still maintain the fitness. I mean, that's the whole reason behind a taper, which that could be another show. We'll talk about taper on another show and how to taper properly, because that's another thing most people get wrong. They don't know how to do it. They're not familiar with the taper literature. So that's another topic for another show. So I'm getting ideas off the top of my head what we can do on future shows. But to answer your question, yes, with even a 2-week break, the VO2 max will significantly decrease. But that's not necessarily a bad thing, because other things will start to heal. The muscle fiber damage from training will heal, and neuromuscular things, neuromuscular fatigue, that stuff can heal. So breaks are important in the training, but just understand that you will see a reduction in the VO2 max in your fitness when you take something like a 2-week break. And even longer, obviously, you're going to have more of a decrease in the VO2 max with a longer break. Another question, does doing high-intensity interval training when at home help maintain VO2 max when I'm otherwise taking a break from aerobic exercise? So there's 2 things to address with this question. One is this term of high-intensity interval training. The fitness industry uses it in a different way. They think jumping up and down and doing burpees and lunges and side squats and all this stuff, that's not high-intensity interval, that's a bodyweight circuit. When you read the scientific research, that term HIIT, high-intensity interval training, comes from the scientific research, and that comes from the more traditional kinds of aerobic exercise. Most of the research has been done on the bike. So on a stationary bike in a lab where you're pedaling really, really fast, taking a break, pedaling really, really fast against the resistance and taking a break. That's high-intensity interval training as the way it's defined by the science. And that's a very different stimulus than doing burpees and squat jumps and push-ups and that kind of stuff. That's not going to have the same impact, because when you ask yourself, well, what are the components? Again, go back to that equation we talked about 15 minutes ago. What are the components of VO2 max related to running or related to cycling, and how are you going to improve that? Jumping up and down and doing body weight kinds of circuit training, that's not going to help deliver blood in the quantity that you need to deliver blood to improve the VO2 max. So the short answer is no. That kind of high-intensity interval training, which I think is misnamed, it's more of a bodyweight circuit. Bodyweight circuit training, if you take someone who's completely sedentary and have them do bodyweight circuit training, well, of course they're going to get more fit, because any stimulus is going to make them more fit. But if you've already been running a lot and you're trying to stay in shape by doing the bodyweight circuit training, that'll help you stay in shape muscularly. I mean, it's good muscle endurance kind of training. And power, if you're doing a lot of jumping stuff, there's a plyometric nature to the jumping. So there's a power advantage to doing that. There's benefits toward that. But in terms of sending a large quantity of blood from the heart and forcing the muscles to consume a large quantity of oxygen that is being delivered to it, then you have to do that kind of specific high-intensity interval training. So whether it means running or getting on a bike and doing the workout on a bike, like I said, most of the research on high intensity interval training comes from on a bike, because it's easier for scientists to control that kind of environment than running. But there's some research done on running on a treadmill inside of a lab, but most of the high intensity interval training research is done on a bike. For example, if you guys are academically inclined and you want to learn more, look up Martin Gabala's research out of McMaster University, where he does like repeated 30 seconds, can't even talk, I'm getting tired, repeated 30 seconds interval workouts and repeated 4 minutes. So he does, in a lot of his research, he's done like repeated 4 minutes at VO2 max intensity, followed by recovery, and then repeat that. And then he does repeated Wingate tests. If you're familiar with the Wingate test, which is a test done in labs all over the world that looks at anaerobic capacity and power. It's 30 seconds all out on a bike with resistance that's set based on your body weight. And he has research that he's published on repeated Wingate tests. So repeated 30 seconds as fast as you can, taking a longer recovery, and then looking at, they look at a lot of things. They look at mitochondrial content and enzyme content inside the mitochondria. And so that's where he's done a lot of really good research on high intensity interval training. So if you look at where that term HIIT has come from, it doesn't come from the body weight circuit training that a lot of people in the fitness industry do. The high intensity interval training is really the more traditional kinds of cardiovascular exercise, like running or swimming or cycling. And that has great benefits for maintaining the VO2 max, during a period of detraining or a period of recovery. But the body weight circuit training, that's a very different kind of stimulus. More questions. Does age, older people, or teens have any impact when training to increase VO2 max? That's a very good question. In terms of adaptability, not as much. Older people, increases in VO2 max have been shown to occur in senior citizens as well as in teenagers. What happens is that, there's a couple of things. That when we get older, because our recovery takes longer, we can't do the workouts as often. When you're a teenager, you can push the pace many times per week because your body recovers in between workouts more rapidly than when you get older. That's the most significant difference of training between younger people and older people, is that older people take more time to recover in between workouts. But how you train the VO2 max and your body's ability to adapt and respond to the training is similar in older people and younger people. In fact, it's very important because when people get older, they tend to be more sedentary. So higher intensity exercise is very important for older people. They have to be careful because you can't just go from being sedentary for 50 years or 60 years and all of a sudden start running as fast as you can. You have to have a period in there of pre-training, if you will, so that you start out easier and then eventually get harder. Whereas a teenager, they can just go and run fast right out of the gate. You got to be more careful with a senior citizen, or even someone who's older. Doesn't even have to be a senior yet. Could be someone my age. I'm in my mid-40s. Even now I have to train differently than I did when I was a teenager. But the ability for the human body to adapt to that training is still there. A lot of seniors, a lot of older people still, they can still expand and increase the VO2 max compared to what it was before when they were not training. That doesn't, our ability to change, our ability for our physiology to change and adapt, that is still very robust even as a senior. Would intervals with skipping rope help increase the VO2 max? Again, not as much. I would put that into the category of the body weight. That's skipping rope is more like plyometrics. It's a low level of plyometrics because it's not as intense as box jumps or thing. You're hopping off the ground a very little bit at a time, but it still have that ballistic motion. So for jump rope, it's still more of the plyometric benefit, the ballistic nature of that. It's not going to help send an enormous amount of, think about, can you try to reach your maximum heart rate when you're jumping rope? It would be very difficult unless you're very, very skilled at jumping rope and you can do it for a longer period of time. You don't have to constantly stop and gather the rope and do it. If you can do a jump rope exercise like you do an interval workout, even then it still would be hard to reach your maximum heart rate jumping rope. And if you want to improve the VO2 max, you have to do the interval workout reaching your maximum heart rate. Just like I said before, if you want to make your biceps stronger, you have to work at the maximum ability for your biceps to do its job. If you want to make the heart stronger and be able to pump more blood and oxygen with each beat, you have to improve the heart's ability to do that. And how do you improve the heart's ability to do that? You run at the maximum capability for your heart to do its job. You know, your heart has only one job. The job description of the heart is pretty simple. It's 2 words: pump blood. All the heart has to do is pump blood. And the more blood it pumps with each beat, then the more blood and oxygen it sends to the working muscles. And so the reason why jump rope would have limitations in terms of improving the VO2 max is because you're not stressing the heart enough when you jump rope. It's not that kind of an activity. It's more of a ballistic, plyometric kind of activity than it is a cardiovascular activity. It would be really hard, and like I said, unless you're very, very skilled at it, it would be very hard to get your heart rate in excess of 90% of its maximum and hold it there for a few minutes and then recover, and then go back and hold it there for a few minutes and then recover. It would be really hard to do that just by jumping rope unless you are very, very, very skilled at jumping rope and you can get the intensity very, very high. Oh, Bestie, all the way from Turkey. Hi, Bestie. We got Bestie here. Sometimes on this show, we're going to have guests. Sometimes it'll just be me talking to the studio camera. We're here in my home studio as we all stay at home. And sometimes I'll have a guest on the show. But we're going to shoot straight. You can think of this like a podcast. You know, I listen to a lot of podcasts. I'm on a lot of podcasts. Everyone says the same thing. Nobody asks the probing questions. And nobody gets to the heart of the research and the science. So this show is going to be different. Run Talk with Dr. Jason every Monday, 12 p.m. Pacific time, 3 p.m. Eastern time. We got another question. Without any method of measurement, how I feel the movement in VO2 max, I've been running regularly for a while. So VO2 max, when you do a workout, it should feel hard but comfortable. Now, the comfortable is, you know, maybe better is hard but manageable. Let's go with that. Hard but manageable, because it's not really comfortable. It is uncomfortable, but it's hard but manageable. It's not all out running. When I say 100% max heart rate, that's 100% max heart rate. That's not 100% all out. 100% all out would be sprinting. That's way above. So VO2 max does not represent the fastest intensity possible. It represents what's going to get you your maximum heart rate. What is the maximum amount of oxygen you can consume to run at that intensity, because we have lots of speeds that can be run at faster than the VO2 max and faster than your max heart rate. You know, you can sprint on the track, you can sprint down the street, and that is much faster than the speed at VO2 max. So VO2 max pace does not mean all out. It's about the fastest pace that you can maintain for about 7 to 10 minutes. If you were to run a race that took 7 to 10 minutes, that pace. So for, like I said before, for good runners, close to 2-mile race pace. For recreational runners, maybe mile to mile and a half, or 1,600 to 2,400 meter race pace. And so it's hard, but manageable. It's enough that you can repeat a few reps of 3 minutes in length or 4 minutes in length, but you're going to be breathing a lot because there's still an anaerobic contribution to the activity when you're running at VO2 max. Even though it represents the size of your aerobic engine, there's still an anaerobic contribution to that pace. It's not purely aerobic anymore. If it were purely aerobic, you would be under the lactate threshold, which is a talk for another show. But VO2 max represents the size of the aerobic engine. But when you're running as fast as the size of that aerobic engine will allow, there's also an anaerobic component to that. So it's hard. It's hard running, but it's still manageable. It's not sprinting for 400 meters. It's still controlled, and it's hard but manageable. So if you were to do a rating of perceived exertion, if you use a scale of 1 to 10, a VO2 max interval workout should feel about an 8.5 to a 9, whereas a race would be a 10. And so a VO2 max workout is hard but manageable, but it's hard. So you got to take those both into play there. It's hard but manageable. Keep repeating that. Hard but manageable. What else do we got here? Okay. Wait for a couple more questions, and then we'll close the show with my final thoughts. We'll always have a final thought on Run Talk with Dr. Jason. So feel free to ask some more questions. We have time for another 1 or 2 questions before we wrap up. So VO2 max is really a beautiful thing. Like I said, if you ever get a chance to go into a lab to witness a VO2 max test or do one yourself, it's a pretty cool test. You run till exhaustion, but it's a pretty short test. If it's done right, if it's planned out right, the VO2 max test shouldn't take more than about 15 minutes because you don't want other things to cause fatigue. You want to reach your maximum heart rate, your maximum cardiac output, and you want to reach your VO2 max. But it is if you're academically inclined and you like reading, there is an enormous amount of research on VO2 max all over the world. So, feel free to get online and look up some of the research on VO2 max. There's a big argument in the field of exercise physiology as to what limits the VO2 max. Is it more cardiac limited or is it more muscular limited? It's a huge argument. You go to academic conferences and scientists like me, we will argue about which is more limiting. There is a handful of scientists that think that it's more muscularly limited, and a lot of other scientists who think it's a limitation of what the heart can pump out. And it turns out that when you take somebody who is sedentary, then they are equally limited by the heart's ability to pump blood and the muscle's ability to consume oxygen. But then as you become more and more and more trained, you start to shift that limitation. It shifts on a sliding scale. We move more and more away from a muscular limitation and more toward a cardiac limitation. So a really, really trained runner, they are more cardiovascularly limited than muscularly limited because the ability to enhance the mitochondria, the capillarization, that is greater than our ability to eject more blood out of the heart. The left ventricle of the heart can only get so large. And the larger the chamber, the more blood it can hold and then subsequently pump. That can only get so large. Your heart's not going to take up the entire size of your chest, right? So there's a limitation as to how much blood that left ventricle can pump out with each beat. It doesn't pump all the blood out because some of the blood has to be left for the heart because the heart needs its own blood supply. And so, you don't eject 100% of the blood out of the heart with every beat. You eject maybe 80% or so when you're running as fast as you can, maybe 85%. Because the heart itself needs its own blood supply, because the heart itself has to work. It needs oxygen for it to contract. The questions. I see a significant drop in pace with increased heart, with increase in temperature. Are they related? Yes. And so when you have high temperature and you go on a long run, the heart rate will start to drift upward even though the pace has not changed. And that we call that cardiac drift. So cardiac drift is an increase in the heart rate that is separate from an increase in the intensity, that the intensity or the pace hasn't changed, but the heart rate is still increasing. Why does it do that? Because our body needs to send more blood to the periphery, to the small blood vessels underneath our skin, so that through convection of air over our bodies, we cool ourselves. And so in order for that to happen, the heart rate will start to increase a little bit to send more blood to the peripheral vessels, underneath our skin here, so that we can cool ourselves, so that we don't die. And so that's why the pace slows down. Even though the heart rate's increasing, the pace is slowing down because some of that cardiac output now is being redistributed to other places to cool ourselves. If your body has a choice between maintaining 6-minute mile pace in a race or sending more blood to the vessels that can cool ourselves so that we don't die, what decision is your body going to make? Of course, it's going to choose the latter. Most runners would want it to choose the former. You want to be able to hold the pace. But your body will make a decision as to, where do I redistribute this blood? What's going to help protect my body from damage? I have to send more blood to the periphery so that through the convection of air, as air flows over our body, that's also why on a hot, humid day where it's still air, or when you're running inside on a treadmill, it's easier to overheat because you don't have that airflow. When there's a breeze outside, you have this airflow over your body and you can cool yourself. And so we send more blood to the small vessels underneath our skin, to our face, to our arms, all over our body, because we have capillaries, all over. So we send more blood to those tiny capillaries, to the surface area, so that we can cool ourselves. So the heart rate will go up, even though the pace is either staying the same or even decreasing, because of the redistribution of blood away from the active muscle tissue and toward the surface area of our body, so we can cool ourselves. Good question. That was a good question. A lot of people don't know that. So that was a good question. Okay, anything else? I came to know about that on Nike documentary on Eliud Kipchoge. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I remember watching that about the sub 2 hours. That was great performance. And so, yeah, there's a lot of things that happen. When you watch elite runners run, oh my God, there's so many things happening inside their body that the public is usually, they have no idea the beauty of what's going on inside an elite athlete's or even a recreational athlete's body when you're running. I mean, it's miraculous that all these things happen. You know, the central nervous system orchestrates this beautiful complex system of, you know, increasing heart rate to send blood there, or dilating vessels to have more blood can go through the vessels, you know, or activating, we have cellular conditions that activate enzyme function to enhance oxygen use. I mean, there's a million different things that happen, and they're unbeknownst to us. We're just outside running. We don't even know these things are happening, but it's beautiful how this whole, it's like a beautiful orchestra, all these things taking place as we run. Okay, so with that, we're going to close the show. And like I said, for every week on Run Talk with Dr. Jason, we're going to close the show with a thought. And my thought of the day is to remember who you are as an animal. You know, we have so much talk about who we are as human beings. The only thing that separates us, the only thing that distinguishes us from all other animals on the planet, is that we have this more highly processed brain where we can think about things and we can project into the future. But beyond that, physically, you know, the human existence is physical. We live a physical life. Our experience on this planet is physical. And when you go out and run, you fulfill your destiny as a physical being. And on the foundation of a fitter physical being, you can build a better life. Thank you for joining us. Come back next Monday for another Run Talk with Dr. Jason. Bye for now.